Hello and welcome to Please Expand, and welcome to Julia's first video representation.
Yeah, I have to say it's really daunting to be recorded and to see my face here. But yes, welcome back. Thank you
Yes,
for
welcome
inviting me
back.
again.
Yeah, I mean, how could I not? I received endless emails about I should get you back. Where's Julia? We want Julia. Bring Julia back. I had no choice. The public spoke.
I'm flattered.
So, Julia, today I'll be interviewing, as you know very well, Michael Strevens, who is a professor of philosophy at New York University, NYU, and who is the author of a book called The Knowledge Machine: How Irrationality Created Modern Science, published in 2020.
Yes. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about him?
Well, he's a professor of philosophy in the philosophy department, obviously, and he specializes, so he writes on and he teaches philosophy of science, which is the field of philosophy where philosophers engage with the scientific activity or with scientific results or anything that scientists claim or do and try to approach it philosophically.
Okay. And what is this book about, more specifically? Not too
So, no,
you
I don't want to give anything away. The Knowledge Machine is Michael's attempt to give an account of what the scientific method is, why it works, how it works, and yeah, I think that's basically it. How it works and why it's so successful at yielding knowledge about the world.
Okay. In contrast with
something like astrology, let's say,
okay,
which yields no knowledge about the world.
Fair enough. And have you structured your interview in any way, or is there anything you can tell us so that we can follow along more easily?
Yes, thank you for asking, Julia. The interview will be divided into 3 sections. So it broadly follows the structure of the book. And so in the first section, we'll be talking about the great methodological debate. So the opposition between objectivity and subjectivity, people who think that science gets at the truth by virtue of its method, and it's because of that it yields truthful and objective information. And people on the other side who claim that science, because it's done by scientists who are finite human beings and have cognitive biases and personal biases and the whole messiness of subjectivity, cannot hope to give an objective account of the world and really just gives this very skewed account of reality. So that's going to really set up the theoretical problem that Michael is facing in the book. And then we're going to move on in the second section to his account, which can be summarized in what he calls the iron rule of explanation, which is this term that he's come up with, which is, and the iron rule of explanation is sort of the cornerstone of what science is and why science is successful. And we're going to unpack that because it has a lot of moving parts that all work together to make the iron rule as successful as it is. And then finally, we're going to talk about the creation of scientists, the education of scientists, how, because that's a really important aspect of his book as well. He talks about what it takes to create a scientific community and the kinds of practices that society has taken up to foster and promote the growth of science and the scientific activity.
Wonderful.
And yeah, so it should be very interesting. It's a wonderful book, and I'm looking forward to hear what you think about it, actually.
And I'm looking forward to listen to the interview.
Okay, then. So then, let's go and let's see what Michael Strevens has to say about the Knowledge Machine. Bye-bye. See you soon. Hello and welcome to Please Expand. Today I have Michael Strevens with me on the podcast to discuss his most recent book, The Knowledge Machine: How an Unreasonable Idea Created Modern Science. Michael, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
So I'm going to sort of try and give a brief introduction of your book, and then I'm going to, you feel free to just add whatever you think I may have missed out. So very generally, your book is about the activity of scientists. In particular, you grapple with two opposing conceptions of scientific activity. On the one hand, those who claim that science is or can be a perfectly objective enterprise, where the truth can be got at. And on the other hand, those who claim that science may like to pretend that it is an entirely objective enterprise, but in reality, it's mired in cultural traditions and the subjectivity that follows from being limited by your sort of cultural worldview, which undermines any claim to objectivity. You think that there is I think I'm right in saying that there's an element of truth in both these sides, and your account seems to do justice to both the essential subjectivity of science, but also its claims to making objective claims about the world. So that's sort of the brief summary that I sort of prepared. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, that's a great summary of the fundamental orientation of the book, which is defending the epistemological power of science as something that is a knowledge-producing machine and something that we can really rely on to produce knowledge, while at the same time doing justice to all the elements of subjectivity that come into individual scientists' reasoning. And I want to explain in the book exactly how the machine works to take ordinary human beings with all of our weaknesses and biases and all of our energy and creativity, and how science harnesses that kind of raw material to create something that I think has really only existed in the last few hundred years since the scientific revolution, something that's able to look into the structure of the universe and really tell us how it all works in a way that the philosophers and the scientists of ancient Greece, China, pretty much everywhere until this tiny little part of the world not so long ago, the ways in which those thinkers, however admirable they may have been, somehow were not able to do.
Yeah. So just to give a brief overview of how the interview will go, I've sort of divided it into three sections. In the first section, we'll talk about these opposing methodological interpretations, sort of set the scene. And I think these disagreements will then prepare us for your contribution, which is the iron rule of explanation. And we'll talk about that and about all the other methodological innovations that you take to be so central to it. And then we'll finish off by talking about precisely what you were talking about just now, about how science manages to persuade all these people to adopt this crazy method and to keep the knowledge machine churning out truth. Okay. So section 1, let's begin. Objectivity versus subjectivity. So let's begin with the defense of science as an enterprise that yields knowledge. I guess this is what most people would be familiar. The average person off the street would probably think that science does yield objective truths. So could you say a bit, you talk about Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn in your book. Could you say a bit about their projects and what they sort of brought to this debate about the scientific method and how it works and what it produces?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when we're discussing the objectivity of science, I'm tempted to emphasize the similarities between Popper's and Kuhn's views of science, even though they're very different in many important ways. So I think both of them would agree that in the long term, science makes progress, and it makes progress by showing how prevailing ideas, big theoretical frameworks, stumble and fall in the face of little observable facts. So there's something about science which is really good at dragging up these little facts, not philosophical arguments or theological incoherences or anything like that, but just little measurements, digging those up and setting up a contest between fact and theory in which the fact ultimately wins. And it's the ability of science to do that, to find these little facts, that is responsible for its progressive aspect, an aspect where you see something very different from the last few thousand years of contesting philosophical or religious schools, something where everybody in the enterprise really seems to be on board with the prevailing wisdom, which doesn't always turn out to be exactly right, but does seem to be pointing forward to the right ideas. So you have this, finally, after thousands of years, agreement on, at the beginning of the scientific revolution, on what the structure of the solar system really is. It's the sun that's in the middle and the earth that goes around it. Agreement on at least the right way mathematically to think about gravity and Newton's theory of gravity, which of course was then amended and improved by Einstein, but in a way that really vindicated the Newtonian framework in many ways. So that's a kind of a conception of the progressiveness and the objectivity of science that Popper and Kuhn share, despite their many differences. I think Kuhn was not happy with the idea that science was somehow getting closer to the truth, yet at the same time he really thought that science progressed and gave us ever better knowledge about the world, in some sense of better. So there's something they had in common. How they differed was in, if you like, the level at which this process of progressive refutation of old theories worked. So for Popper, it's very much at the level of the individual scientist's thought. Popper thought that the animating spirit of a really good scientist was precisely to orchestrate this progress, to find these facts and show that they refuted existing theories. So for Popper, science is all about falsification, and the spirit of the scientist is a falsifying spirit. The scientist doesn't want to prove their theories, they want to show that they're wrong so that new and better theories can come along after them. For Kuhn, same idea, that old theories are going to be destroyed and the new theories built on top of those smoking ruins. But for Kuhn, the level at which this happens is more a social level. The individual scientists, in some sense, don't really know what they're doing, amazingly. They tend, Kuhn thinks, to actually believe in the prevailing theory, and they think what they're doing is just polishing it up. They're filling out the story that the theory tells. They're applying the mathematical models or the characteristic explanatory forms of that theory to more and more problems, just showing how perfect and how expansive and how ultimately right in every way that theory is. And they're so excited about this project, and they're so driven to make the theory work in every single arena and in every single way, that they actually unwittingly discover the ways in which the theory doesn't work. Okay? They're animated by this sort of great fervor to have the theory work everywhere. They try to apply it everywhere and turn up exactly the places where the theory falls down. And so they become, to put it in Popper's language, not Kuhn's, they become unwitting falsifiers of the prevailing theory. And this is what sparks the great scientific revolutions that Kuhn writes about.
Right. Okay, that's great. That's a great introduction. So we've got falsification, and we've got these sort of this description of how individual scientists function within the sort of the scientific enterprise. So this all sounds great. And you might think, yeah, this is how science works. I can imagine scientists working like this. But as it turns out, sociologists, figures like Bruno Latour, who have sort of have followed scientists in the laboratory, have sort of discovered that it's not really how scientists work. And you give a really, really nice, you retell the anecdote of Bruno Latour's experience in this laboratory in California in the 70s and sort of what he discovers. So would you mind retelling that story? Because I think it's a really helpful illustration of what exactly we're talking about when we're saying that there is a lot of subjectivity in science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So Latour decided to go into this lab, which was a kind of brain science lab where people were trying to figure out the structure of various chemicals that are used for communication in the brain. He decided to go in there in an anthropological spirit. Instead of knowing what he was in for, he was going to go among these people, the scientists, and treat them as though they were in effect alien beings whose folkways he had no way of fathoming, and just go in and talk to them, see what they're up to, and write down everything without any kind of background bias or prejudice or story about the way science really works to sort of aid his interpretation. Now, I mean, by his own lights, he was never going to entirely succeed in eliminating all of his biases, although he did claim to know absolutely nothing about science when he went in there. Well, maybe. But he was a good observer. And one of the kinds of things that he reported on in great detail, he spent a very long time in the lab, as an ethnographer might spend years among some culture. He spent certainly over several years that he was doing the project, a very long time actually just hanging out with these scientists and seeing how they actually made their decisions, recording the details of their. And what he found was that there was a lot that was I think if you were just going to use one word, a lot that was negotiated. So rather than just looking at the evidence and saying, oh, well, this evidence tells us that such and such a theory is wrong, such and such a person is wrong, something that, in effect, both Popper and Kuhn assume that science has this kind of a sort of logical framework, although for Kuhn, one that changes from theory to theory. Latour found scientists sitting around saying, well, it depends. Do we count this as a falsification? Do we count this as a problem for a theory? Well, it really depends on the kind of what you mean in this case by falsification, because there's always these kind of, I suppose you might call them parameters that can be adjusted a little bit. And there's not really a single right setting for these parameters. So to give you a more concrete example, you want to know whether this your hypothesis about the structure of some chemical substance is correct. And what you do, because you can't just kind of dive into the molecular structure as though you had little molecular glasses on. What you do is or the kind of technique they were using there is to create a kind of what they're using is a technique called gas chromatography. But what you get in effect is a sort of a little readout of bumps and blobs and so on. Just think of it as on a piece of paper, and you create one of those for the substance you're trying to analyze, and then you create it for a substance that has been specified, synthesized chemically to be the one that you think has the same structure as the one you're analyzing. So if your hypothesis is right, these two substances have the same structure. If you're wrong, they don't. And you do the gas chromatography for the two substances. You hold up the bits of paper and you say, do I get the same reading on both? Now you might think, well, that's straightforward. You just compare them, and if they're identical, then that's great. And if they're different, they're not. But actually, it turns out that even when the substances are identical, there's going to be some level of fudging or slippage. They're going to kind of look similar, but not exactly the same. So you have to make a kind of a judgment. Are these the same or not? And Latour realized that in this, and he was right, this is so common throughout science, it is a bit of a judgment call. You look at these things, and some people might say they're the same, some people might say they're different. When different scientists, even in the same lab, get together and talk about this, they actually are it's kind of like they're negotiating over a deal. Well, we could count these two as similar, but we would have to count these two as different, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the upshot here is that there is a lot of room for subjectivity in science. Not in this case, not necessarily a scientist. Well, they might be pushing an agenda, or it might just be that there's kind of different people have somebody is a real stickler, and they're not going to count these two bits of paper as being the same unless they're really, really similar, and somebody else is prepared to allow for a bit more slop. And there's no kind of hard and fast rule to tell you which way to go on a question like this. Both Popper and Kuhn write as though there really are these hard and fast rules. Right. Okay, I think they know in the back of their heads it's not that simple, but they're kind of assuming that for the most case, this stuff is decided. Look, the evidence either falsifies the theory or not. But in fact, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussion. Things flip around. Something that's thought to be decisive later gets decided not to be decisive after all. And so in the short term, and even to some extent in the immediate term, in the intermediate term, you see quite a lot of back and forth, quite a lot of disagreement on how to interpret the evidence. One group of scientists says, this is a clear refutation. Another says, not so fast. And this is the condition of sort of science as it's being made. Simply a lot of disagreement about what the evidence actually says.
Right. That's really good. Because something that I was wondering is, why do Kuhn and Popper get it so wrong? Is it because they're not scientists? Because Kuhn, he wasn't a scientist per se, but he worked around scientists. He knew a lot of scientists.
Yeah, he started in physics, but he wasn't in a lab for years on end doing this kind of experimentation, dealing with these instruments and all of their problems and so on. So I don't think he was ignorant about this side of science, but I don't think he took it as seriously as Latour, other sociologists of science, historians, and philosophers have since taken it as a real obstacle to interpreting science as a kind of a machine for interpreting evidence, something that simply sort of tells us what to think in the light of the evidence. Back in the 1940s or 50s, that story about science would probably have been thought to be, roughly on the right track. And these days we think, no, actually, roughly it's on the wrong track. The whatever's going on, it's not. It involves more than just a few departures from agreement on how to interpret the evidence. In fact, disagreements on how to interpret the evidence are the norm. Yeah. That's what's going on most of the time. If you just look at a little time slice, a little window of scientific inquiry.
And this is where a concept you introduce, plausibility rankings, sort of is really central. Every scientist will have their own plausibility rankings, how much to assign error to an instrument, or how lenient to be with how similar something looks.
That's right. Whether scientists have opinions about other scientists' labs, they may think a certain scientist's results are a little bit suspicious. Needless to say, so they don't totally trust the scientist to, in effect, do the work in the right way. Even a quite prominent scientist, of course, that scientist, meanwhile, will have far greater trust in themselves for reasons that I don't need to explain. So the notion of a plausibility ranking really just gathers together many different sources of subjectivity. Some of it might just be temperamental, as I was talking about that stickler when it came to comparing the two chromatograph readings. That might just be a matter of temperament, or something about school days. And then some of it is frankly, kind of self-regarding. So the scientist, you're going to think your own lab is more reliable probably than other people will think your lab is. Some of it has to do with kind of ideological traditions, or just research traditions, or just really a certain kind of patriotism. On the whole, scientists tend to regard their colleagues who came from the same labs or the same PhD programs with a bit more trust than those who come from a different place. Maybe they just feel like they understand what's going on better. So it's not necessarily that tribal. But these kinds of differences of opinion coming from all of many different sources are sufficient. And I think this is just the received wisdom these days in philosophy of science and other areas of science studies. They're sufficient to explain really why it is that the interpretation of the evidence in science is this perpetually contested thing, at least in science that's currently alive, that's being done.
And just it's not another question, plausibility rankings, because it strikes me that you might sort of divide them into various degrees of plausibility. Let's say you think an instrument isn't working particularly well. You could always go back, tweak it, and then redo the experiment. But you might have a background assumption about how the universe is constituted, and that might come into your plausibility. That might be part, and that's not something that you can actually resolve tomorrow by going back into that. Seems to be much more resilient to retesting, for example. So in science,
that's right. Yeah. These background assumptions can even be quite low level, about whether a certain instrument is very prone to a certain kind of error.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be a big theory about the way the universe is built, but it might still be very difficult to just go back and decide that issue in the short term, especially when a lot of experimentation is actually very expensive and time consuming, and errors happen all the time, even with the best instruments. These are typically very sensitive things. Right. So it's not easy to resolve these kinds of disagreements in the short term, or scientists would. I mean, I think most scientists don't necessarily want to disagree about this stuff. It's just really, it's very fancy, complicated, difficult, expensive stuff to nail down, and it takes a long time.
Okay, so it's really something that's baked into scientific practice. It's part of scientific practice, which involves all these instruments, all these different ways of measuring. This is all baked into it, and just this degree of subjectivity is just part of the fabric of the scientific activity.
I think that's exactly right. It's really more or less unavoidable given the kinds of things that scientists are doing.
Do you think scientists are aware of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think they really
Okay.
are. You wouldn't necessarily know it because scientists like to kind of tell the story of discovery typically in a way that tidies everything
Okay.
up, and makes it seem like a simple logical progression from experiment to theory. But at the same time, scientists are in the thick of these issues about interpreting the evidence. They're constantly arguing with one another about the stuff. So of course they know really, if they were to be honest with themselves, that just the question of how to understand the evidence is far more contentious than they might be making out in some of their more public-facing comments.
Right. Okay, great. All right, so I think we've come to the end of the first section. We sort of looked at how someone might think science is an objective enterprise, but then we've also looked at some rather concerning discoveries, right, of how scientific activity actually works. I think these are the kinds of things that if everyone knew about on a day-to-day basis, they might become concerned when they hear about scientific findings. Okay, and then so in comes the iron rule of explanation. This is your contribution in the book. So could you introduce it? What is the iron rule of explanation? How does it help us?
Sure. Well, I mean, it doesn't look on paper. It doesn't look like a very big deal. I should begin by saying, but it is the thing that I think is responsible more than anything else in modern science for somehow converting all of the subjectivity into something that is much more like the objectivity that you see in science when you take the long view. Okay. Actually, you asked me earlier why Popper and Kuhn were not more sensitive to the subjectivity. And maybe the reason above all is because they tended to take the long view. You know, Kuhn is a historian, Popper is looking at the hit parade of modern physics. They see in the long term, and I think they see correctly, that it really is the case that ultimately theories just are objectively unsustainable in the light of enough of the right kind of evidence. And yet this is exactly the same kind of evidence that in the short term scientists are arguing about. So how can that be? That I might almost sound like I've contradicted myself. How can this evidence be so subjective in the short term and so decisive and agreed to be decisive in the longer term? Really, the answer to that is very simple. It's that in the longer term, much more evidence has accumulated. So you can argue about little experiments here and there, the way this particular measurement was conducted, the conditions over here, the vicissitudes of this particular instrument, and so on. But over time, experiments get performed in different situations by different scientists using different instrumentation, and it looks once you have enough of this kind of evidence, it begins to kind of line up in a way where you'd have to be virtually a conspiracy theorist to doubt that the prevailing theory, the old theory, is really so great. So it's a matter of quantity. And the iron rule of explanation is, which I have yet to actually state, but I will in a moment. Its job is in fact simply to motivate, or I should say I see its secret, if you like, is that it motivates scientists to produce the right kind of evidence in the right kind of quantity to get the job done in the long term. So how does it do that? Well, here's what the iron rule says. It's interestingly, it's actually a rule about what can be published in scientists' official channels of communication, scientific journals, and so on. So it doesn't, in fact, overtly regulate in any way what scientists actually do in their observational or experimental work, in their theorizing, and so on. It just restricts the way that they report what they do. But in so doing, as you'll see in a moment, it indirectly has a big effect on what they're doing the rest of the time, because there's only certain things that they can report. Okay, finally, let me actually say what the rule is. The rule says that we must assess theories exclusively by looking at their empirical success or failure. You can put it in terms of prediction? Do they make good predictions, or do they make bad predictions? Or you can put it in terms of explanation. Some areas of science are really not so predictive, like evolutionary theory, for example. It's more about explaining what we've actually what we see in the record of the evolution of life. And there we want a theory that is good at explaining a lot of things rather than bad at explaining. But explaining is, in a way, just a kind of a reverse retrospective prediction in these cases, I think. So the difference is not necessarily that great. But anyway, so far you may be thinking, well, what have I said that's at all interesting or surprising? Science is all about explaining, predicting the observable facts. Yes, very true. But what's important about the iron rule is it has a rather narrow conception of what counts as the kind of empirical fact that science should be in the business of explaining. But even more important, it rules out all other forms of argument. So it rules out philosophical arguments, religious arguments, even aesthetic arguments for or against theories. It focuses scientists entirely in their reporting, in the way they write up their theories, on this question of empirical success. Now, many scientists do take some of these other things into consideration when they're trying to figure out what's right, what's wrong, what are the promising avenues of research, and all of that stuff. A good example of this, a modern example of this, is all the physicists who say that theoretical beauty is really important to deciding what's viable or promising in fundamental physics. But when they go to write it up, it has to be all about just, we get this prediction right, we can explain this stuff. And the iron rule is above all a kind of restriction to that kind of argument. It's enforces a kind of narrowness on scientists' reports that may not be present in their thinking, but which means, by creating a kind of a bottleneck, if you like, means that if they're going to be successful scientists, they really have to throw all of their energy into this kind of empirical argument. And when they have a disagreement, when they come to one of these points where we're saying, well, is this instrument so reliable? Is this source of error something that's really worrying, or something that we can safely dismiss? Are these background assumptions we're making really as reliable as we think? All of those arguments have to be resolved simply by further empirical testing. So in a way, this is science. This is science the way that it's presented in, for example, high schools here in the US. When people talk about the scientific method, you just go back to the lab, back to make more observations. But it means that the rule means that, first of all, there's no kind of ideological fissures, which may in fact exist, or even just intense personal rivalries, which may actually exist in the social world of science, really can't be brought to bear in any direct way in the published stuff. It's got to be, everyone has to at least pretend that they're taking one another seriously, and that they're going to go back and argue just using measurements, just observable facts. So there's a kind of always this way forward that everyone can agree on, even if they don't agree on what kind of progress they're making by taking this way forward. And that way forward involves just producing more and more observable fact, more and more detail that's designed to test exactly the kinds of theories, assumptions, or for that matter, instruments, methods that are being contested. And so the evidence piles up. There's if you're going to, sometimes I compare it to it's a kind of a game almost. I mean, a very serious game. But a game where the rules say you've got, every move has to be, as it were, an empirical move. It has to be another empirical test, or designing a theory to be tested, or designing an instrument to perform these tests. It has to somehow contribute to this enterprise of empirical testing. So scientists who are going to play this game have to just produce more and more of a certain kind of data, often data that's, and maybe we'll talk about this more in a moment, but data that's very expensive or time-consuming to produce, but it's the only way to play the game. So we've got to do it. And that's how the iron rule funnels all of scientists' energy into simply increasing the quantity of evidence to the point where these interpretive disputes finally are, I don't know if not so much resolved often as simply crushed under the weight of the evidence. Everyone looks at the evidence, they may think about it differently, but they have to agree that the old ideas, the Ptolemaic world system, or for that matter, Newtonian gravity, is just no longer a viable theory.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to make. And I think it echoes something that I found in David Wootton's book, The Invention of Science, where he really emphasizes the importance that you finally have a community of people who are doing science. And it seems like what you're saying requires that you have people who are agreeing to play by the same rules with each other. They're willing to communicate in the same way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So the iron rule tells us how we can play the game of science. Okay. And you've already sort of hinted at an answer to this question, which is the long-term view. But we still have sort of the issue of that pesky subjectivity and plausibility rankings, which sort of seems to almost infect sort of the small-scale experiments that we see. And you've got another great term, Baconian convergence here, which is, as you said, if you get enough evidence together, it will eventually crush the bad evidence, or good science will drive out bad science. Another way of maybe putting that term. So I just want to ask a sort of a conceptual question about what the implication of this is, because often in debates about scientific method, it's always sort of subjectivity, objectivity. And what you seem to be saying is that there is something about what it is for something to be objective is that it has these pockets of subjectivity in it. And when you get enough subjectivity together, it eventually becomes something objective. That it's not subjective and objective, it's the accumulation of the subjective with obviously objective stuff as well, because you're still doing empirical tests, but it seems to be that sort of accumulation that gives us the objective, the like with a big O, the one that we want. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, almost when you put it that way, it almost sounds like alchemy. But I think if you look up a little bit more closely, you can see that the process is not so strange. So where does the subjectivity come from? Let me use another one of the examples I use in the book. So this has to do with the experimental work or empirical work that was done to investigate whether Einstein's new general theory of relativity, a new theory of gravity, was better than Newton's old theory of gravity. So some of the early scientists who are excited about this, like Arthur Eddington, really thought there was something beautiful and explanatorily very elegant about Newton's theory, but Einstein's theory. But in accordance with the iron rule, Eddington knew if he was going to argue for this theory, then he would have to front up with some facts. So one of the things you can do to test the theory is to see how strongly light rays are bent by gravity. And the way to do this, really the only practical way, which is still pretty impractical, is to look at the effect of the sun on very nearby stars, that is, stars that appear to be right next to the sun's disk, which you have to do during a total eclipse, because otherwise the sun is so bright it just, of course, drowns out the stars. So Eddington and a few other scientists sailed off to photograph the positions of these stars around the sun during an eclipse. Anyway, to fast forward a little bit to the denouement, they got a lot of good data, but also a lot of confusing data. And in particular, they had two telescopes from each with their own cameras from one of the sites. They were doing this operation in Brazil, and they came up with contrary results. One of them looked good for Einstein, the other one looked good for Newton. But the one that looked good for Newton was also, those photographs were a little bit blurred, not so blurred that you couldn't get measurements out of them and see that they were, as I say, good for Newton. But something had gone wrong with the experiment a little bit. Questioned, had it gone so wrong that those results should simply be dismissed? Something went wrong here. We just shouldn't trust this data. Or was it, as often happens in science, data that's kind of not perfect, but good enough to at least start drawing some conclusions. Now, what Eddington and his team actually did is they just rejected it out of hand. But some of the other scientists working in the same field, actually interested in performing the same kinds of measurements, thought that that was too quick. That there were, although it was certainly possible that there had been the kind of systematic error with this data that made it useless, it was also possible that there was good information here. Now, it's not so easy to sail off and find a total eclipse and perform these experiments. It requires the right kind of eclipse. It requires months and months of preparation. It requires good luck on the day, clear skies and so on. So it wasn't, this isn't something you can do over and over again in a hurry. So there was just for a while, there was this kind of disagreement on exactly how to treat these results. Did they, as it were, cloud Eddington's results, or was this a clear victory for relativity? It wasn't obvious. Well, how did that question eventually get resolved? One of the prominent doubters of Eddington's experiment, who, as I say, was in the same business, actually ultimately obtained results from a different eclipse. This was about 3 years later, that really seemed to that did not in any way favor Newton, so that really gave the right kind of Einsteinian bending. And that's a good example of the data piling up in a way that resolves certain kinds of doubts on which scientists come down on different sides. So with that original telescope, you had Eddington, who was part of the team that actually produced the data, and also Eddington himself was very enthusiastic about Einstein's theory, sort of inclined to dismiss those results entirely, and thereby producing a pretty strong result in favor of Einstein, whereas another scientist, motivated in various ways, is saying, not so fast. And, perhaps quite reasonably. But then another experiment comes along that's done in different conditions. The results are a little bit different, a little bit clearer, actually. And the doubter says, okay, I think that was a good one. I'm on board with Einstein now. And you can see other scientists looking on may well have reacted the same way. Further experiments have been done since then, really piling up the data, and now there's not a lot of doubt. And it's really because these individual questions on which people really never agreed on an answer. What should be done with those results from the Brazilian telescope? It's still not the case that people agree on that question, but it's just not important anymore because there's so much other data that has come along since. So this subjectivity expresses itself not in people just kind of yelling at one another in a way that's unresolvable, but in specific disagreements about what happened in specific situations. And the way that more and more data can resolve those disagreements is sometimes by showing what really happened, but actually much more often simply by rendering those disagreements moot. It doesn't really matter what we think about the Brazilian telescope anymore because we have all this other data. And so the kinds of entirely reasonable questions that different scientists have about different bits of data eventually get addressed to the point where pretty much everyone is satisfied. Not satisfied in the same way or even satisfied by the same data. They weigh different questions differently, and with enough data, everyone is happy. And that's essentially the way the convergence process tends to work. It's not logically guaranteed that it will turn out that way, but looking at the history of science over and over, it does.
So what's really incredible is that science harnesses all this noise, almost ambition, rivalries, and it puts them in the direction of its own fulfillment. And it's only because you have someone, because one concern might be, right, one concern might be, I don't know, you've got a whole generation of young physicists who read Arthur Eddington's paper, and he's a fairly influential physicist, and you might be concerned that, well, because of this sort of non-objective decision to sort of set aside these images, that he's going to influence a whole generation of physicists and skew sort of the project of science in this direction without any proper evidence. But that's to sort of not take into account something fundamental about human nature, which is that that's not how it works. You're going to have people who are going to push back and want to disagree, and they have their own opinions and their own beliefs and their own approaches for how they want to resolve the problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also on top of that, if you want to be if you want to succeed as a scientist, as a scientist. It's not enough just to pick the right side and kind of join the team. You need to play that game, which means you need to produce your own data. So you need to either, if this is the issue you really want to work on, either resolve those, set out to resolve those disagreements in a way that will defend Eddington, or set out to undermine him. And in doing that, regardless of your actual goals, you'll turn up more data and therefore contribute to this process of conversion. So there's something about just the very nature of the game where it can't get stuck at a point where people just agree to disagree. Because if they were to do that, they would be no longer scientists.
They'd be philosophers.
Yeah, they'd be philosophers. They'd be journalists.
So even if you had a whole bunch of students who agreed with Eddington, nevertheless, they would still come up against the evidence. And they would discover things for themselves, even if they just blindly followed him.
Exactly. And of course, it's not, again, there's no guarantees here. Sometimes it does happen that a certain dogma just gets stuck for a while and nobody questions it for a while, or it's even possible that a certain group of scientists are institutionally so powerful that they protect it for a while. But typically, science it's a big, diverse, sprawling enterprise, and an enterprise where you can only get ahead by doing more empirical testing. And so those kinds of temporary roadblocks, on the whole, it seems, get swept away. Again, I'll say there's no guarantees here, and it's possible to imagine a kind of dystopian future for science where one group just gets its fingers in so deeply that people get permanently stuck. That's possible. But given the way that science is set up, that on the whole doesn't happen.
So it seems that science also requires a certain, maybe here we can echo Karl Popper's concerns, it requires a certain free society where people are able to actually express opposing views.
Exactly. Yeah. A kind of a conception of the enterprise that has a bit of, I emphasize the competitive side of it. But of course, it has to be a competition where people are free to compete. So on the one hand, the freedom opens the doors, and then the competitive spirit kind of pushes people to go through the doors.
Okay, great.
Important.
Okay, then. So I'd like to talk now about these 4 methodological innovations that are essential to the functioning of the Iron Rule. And the first one is a notion of explanatory power that all scientists can agree on. And I think you make the rather interesting observation that the kind of explanations that science favors are rather shallow ones. So they're not trying to explain everything. They're just trying to explain why these two things occur, why A causes B, without making any further assumptions about what A is or what B is or what the thing is that is causing them. And I think this shallow explanatory power is the kind of thing that maybe sometimes frustrates philosophers with science, because you think, how can you be satisfied with this explanation? You're not asking all these other huge questions about the being of what you're discussing. So could you say a bit about sort of how the historical sort of origin of people being content with this shallow explanation? We're going from Aristotle, who explained everything in this beautiful tapestry of interconnecting connections, to people being satisfied with very simple explanations, but explanations which have sort of profound significance nevertheless.
Yeah, so explanations that are the shallow explanation is what I was describing earlier when I said it's really just a kind of like a sort of a retrospective prediction. So it doesn't to count as a good explanation, doesn't have to go down deeply into the essential nature of things or anything like that. You just have to have a set of causal principles like Newton's laws of motion and his gravitational force law, and derive the things you want to explain from that. And the person, I think, who is above all responsible for making that okay in science, making that enough, is Newton himself. So he at least when he looked back over his work later, the way he explained what he was doing is he said, look, it's enough to explain all of the things I've set out to explain, the motions of the planets, the tides, and so on. It's enough simply to derive them from these principles I've laid out, the laws of motion and the gravitational force law, and and just a little bit more. That's good enough. Now, how did he persuade people that that was good enough? I think basically by being incredibly successful. So he sort of set up. He said, "Here's my method. Here's what I did. Here's what I cared about." The scientists who followed him looked at that and said, wow, okay, let's try doing it that way. And in fact, it worked out very well. We know from Newton's private papers that he himself personally actually went a lot deeper than his official theories did. He was interested in deep explanation, but for whatever reason, he kind of conceived of his project when he wrote the Principia, when he laid out his theory of gravitation, as one that would just be concerned with the shallow side of things. I don't think we'll ever know exactly what was going on in his head when he did it that way, but it's easier to see what's going on in subsequent heads when they say, okay, well, that worked out really well, let's do it that way, which is, I think, really kind of the beginning of the sort of understanding that ultimately constitutes the iron rule, that it's what we should do is just try to write down equations or print, they don't have to be mathematical, but theories, hypotheses that get the observable facts right. And the big thing about science is going to be to just do that and to at least pretend to play this game where we're doing that as the only thing we'll take seriously as a way of arguing for and against theories. So there's a sort of, I talked earlier about a kind of a narrowing. Here also there's a kind of a shallowing of the official scientific discourse, the discourse that's in the journals, that on the face of it actually looks rather, as you said, from a philosophical point of view, it seems rather impoverished. Yet it's also what creates that rather restricted channel that focuses so much of scientists' energy, well, all of it in effect, on empirical testing, and therefore on what it ultimately turns out to take to achieve what I call Baconian convergence, to build up a level of consensus in the light of the data about whether the prevailing ideas are right or wrong.
Yeah, that's just. I found that very interesting because you've touched on another important distinction, another important innovation, which is the distinction between public scientific argument and private scientific reasoning, which, again, I think it captures the humanity of the scientists we're involved in. It's not just these robots that are engaged in empirical testing, but people who have private beliefs. But the important thing for you is that they sort of set them aside and they focus on just what the empirical testing gives them. Just with this distinction in mind between scientific argument and non-scientific reasoning, I wanted to talk a bit about your chapter on beauty, on the role of aesthetic reasoning in science, because I thought that was, I wouldn't say provocative, but it was thought-provoking. Provocative because I've always been. I would have said that I would have thought that it really shouldn't play a role in science. And you want to so I actually want to figure out more what exactly you think about what you think the role of beauty or aesthetic considerations should play in the scientific activity. I understand that you don't think it should be part of scientific argument. Okay, fine. That's just empirical side. But you say it can be part of scientific deliberation, I believe is the term you use. And I wonder if you could just flesh that out a bit. How exactly should ideas of mathematical elegance, for example, influence how scientists do science?
Okay. The iron rule says no aesthetic arguments in print, as it were, or in the journals. So someone like Eddington, who was really influenced by the explanatory mathematical elegance of Einstein's theory of relativity, couldn't go out and argue for it, try to persuade his fellow scientists, at least not officially, by laying out this elegance, even though it's not it's something that certainly can be laid out. It's not ineffable or anything like that. There's a certain very particular things you can point to that Einstein's theory makes sense of, that just aren't really explained in the same way in an elegant way by Newton's theory. So he could have, in a world without the iron rule, Eddington could have done that, and I would guess that's probably what he would have done. Okay. So what's going on here? On the one hand, he, a scientist, is being influenced by considerations of elegance, but he's being pushed precisely by his admiration for Einstein's theory to argue for that theory empirically, because that's the only way to kind of advance views in print in the journal. So this is where this very important distinction comes in between, on the one hand, what's going on in the scientist's own head, in Eddington's head, the appreciation for mathematical elegance, and on the other hand, what goes on in print. Eddington has to lay out the table of data from this eclipse expedition and argue that Einstein's theory gets the right value for the bending angle of light. That's the basic situation. So it's not this leaves open the question of whether anyone should really pay attention to mathematical beauty. I mean, maybe that's the way the iron rule works, and you can see how it's working to do what I've said it does, to just build up the big pile of relevant evidence. But should scientists pay attention to mathematical elegance even where in the arena where they're allowed to, that is in their own heads, or actually for that matter, anywhere unofficial? So scientists write popular books about the beauty of physics as well. There's a whole pile of those we can point to. But should they? Well, I don't, it's not really a part of my project to argue yes or no, but it's such an interesting question, I can't resist it. What I see when I confront this question in the knowledge machine is that sometimes in some areas a concern for the right kind of beauty has been very fruitful, and in other areas a concern for the wrong kind of beauty has actually been quite an impediment to theoretical advances. So that may sound not very helpful, except I think that, for example, the fundamental physicists who now tout beauty as a really important consideration, privately, of course, just each in their own head, in evaluating theories, I think they can look back and see a history of a certain kind of beauty being important in their own area, and it's quite reasonable for them to think that aesthetic considerations are actually quite a good guide to where to go. Certainly not an infallible guide, and well, the problem of induction, just because it's worked in the past doesn't mean it will work in the future. But still, it's quite reasonable, I think, to believe that. So that at least I will maintain. Well, at the same time, acknowledging that that's just not true in every area of science or for every kind of beauty that thinkers have found striking in the past. But so I do think, therefore, ultimately, I think a sort of you might say even an empirically informed conception of the right kind of beauty to attend to is a really valuable thing for some scientists. Or to be slightly more cautious, it appears to be really valuable. We have good reason to think that it's valuable. So that makes me, in a qualified way, pro beauty.
So obviously the kind of stuff we're talking about is generally mathematical elegance, right? It's what usually theoretical physicists find to be beauty on a mathematical standard. Mm-hmm. Do you think, are we making some assumptions about how the universe is? Are we saying that there is something mathematical, essentially is there something about mathematics that is so good at revealing the world to us that it's reasonable to pay attention to mathematical symmetry, elegance, simplicity, all these sort of aesthetic terms that mathematicians and theoretical physicists appreciate?
I think this kind of reasoning, in some sense, yes, has that assumption behind it, that we live in an elegant universe. But as I say, it's not as if that's hanging in an empirical void as an assumption, insofar as looking back at the history of physics and ideas that have worked well, at least in a certain kind of physics, we see that on the whole they've turned out to be pretty elegant. You could say, well, we have at least some evidence that we do live in an elegant universe. It'd be foolish to ignore that information. Yeah. I'm sure it's coming from all sorts of sources that are themselves, if we just examine them in isolation, are not obviously reliable, kind of yearning for harmony, beauty, and so on. But one that you might say has turned out to be at least partially vindicated.
This sort of concern is also echoed in Sabine Hossenfelder's book, Lost in Math, right? And her concern there is that aesthetic considerations are unduly influencing research programs. The assignment of funds, I think her particular concern is towards the building of an ever larger Hadron Collider. What do you make of that? What do you make of the role of aesthetic deliberation in research, in decisions about which directions research should go? Because that's something that seems to almost straddle the domain, these two domains that we're talking about, between official scientific argument and private reasoning, right?
No, right. So a lot can hinge on it, on this aesthetic reasoning. Once we're talking about billion-dollar projects. So I think, the way I interpret Hossenfelder is as actually a useful cautionary voice. She says, just because beauty has worked so far, don't assume that it's going to continue to work. And I think there she's not just articulating a principal point. She's saying we're already starting to get evidence in the failure of theories like supersymmetry. We're starting to get evidence that the concern for elegance is not working out right now with the problems that we have right now. So in a way, she's in the tradition of sort of paying exactly the tradition I'm endorsing, of paying careful attention to where aesthetic thinking is working and where it isn't. So I think that's a good thing. And in the end, I'm not really certainly in no better position than anyone else to say whether we should spend all of this money. These are indeed subjective decisions, and when the subjective decisions are guiding the way that individual scientists are using their research money and their labs, that's one thing. But when you're talking about these projects where everyone in effect has to coordinate on a single thing, then things start to look risky again. There's not this kind of bet hedging you typically get in science where many different approaches are being taken at once. It's just one big thing, and yet we're not going to make progress, it's being said, unless we have something that big. I don't have anything original to say about that, except that we should be a little bit cautious.
Right. Okay, great. Okay, then, so let's just go to the final section where we just talk about how science creates scientists, how we manage to persuade people to stare at tiny samples of brain for 20 years. So as we've already touched on many times, you make the point that there is a sort of something irrational about science, that it demands of you to set aside a whole host of considerations, philosophical, theological, aesthetic, that you might not only cherish but deem important in life. And it asks you to just focus on what you can observe. And you dedicate the final part of your book on this topic, on the training of the scientist, on making the scientific mind. So could you say a bit about that? What the sort of the strategies are for getting people to think this way?
Yeah, sure. So there's really two levels of strategy. One is simply the iron rule itself, which, as I've said, sort of sets out a game. And to say, use the example of Eddington again, Eddington is privately convinced by the mathematical elegance of relativity, but if he's going to play the game, he has to sail off to Brazil or the coast of Africa to photograph the eclipse, months-long expedition with no guarantee of success. There's a way in which the iron rule takes any kind of scientist, and by saying to them the reasons you care most about are just not going to be considered legitimate in the science game, forces them to be empiricists. And that's really, when I talk about irrationality, it's above all that I have in mind. The rule is saying this stuff might be important, but we're going to forget about it. There's something logically wrong about that, ignoring powerful, relevant, informative considerations, like the aesthetic character of theories and fundamental physics. But also something that's very practically right about it. It's because Eddington got on the boat that we started getting the data, and because scientists after him were willing to do similar kinds of very demanding, expensive experiments, that we have the data. So the rule is really working well there. But I also talk, as you say in those final chapters, about the way the science, the education of scientists proceeds. In many cases, I think, emphasizing the iron rule to the point where the scientists themselves become as narrow as the rule. I think it would be a shame if the education system entirely succeeded in that goal. I think there's a wonderful way in which the whole institution of science is able to have it both ways in a very fruitful way. Someone like Eddington, on the one hand, is able to bring in aesthetic considerations as far as they're relevant and important and helpful in his private thinking to decide what he really cares about. But then at the same time, is because of the prohibition on aesthetic reasoning in the iron rule, is forced to go and do the experiments. That way we get a lot of the benefit of aesthetic thinking, but also this 100% focus on the empirical when it comes to actual scientific persuasion that has been so fruitful in the past. So we don't really we want to implement the iron rule in the pages of the journals, but we don't want to implement it in the heads of scientists, I think. And one of the things I write about near the end of the book is in effect a kind of a cautionary note about this. Maybe in many cases it doesn't matter too much, but don't let scientists become too narrow. At the same time, don't lessen in any way their allegiance to the iron rule. Okay, they've got to, in some sense, the ideal of scientific argument as empirical reasoning has to be sustained, because that's what the iron rule is about. Whereas at the same time, scientists kind of let all this other stuff in through the back doors of the mind to inform them wherever appropriate. It's a nice balance, I think, that science has struck for the last few hundred years. And I hope we can keep it.
And your book ends on a rather optimistic note that even though science, or maybe technology better, is sort of the cause of a lot of our problems nowadays, like maybe climate change, the Industrial Revolution, whatnot, it's also currently our greatest hope for solving these problems. And so I was struck by this idea of science as both the cause of problems and the solution of problems. It's perpetuating itself in this respect, in some regard. Do you think this is partially because of this, this schizophrenic way of being, that on the one hand, the scientific domain is sort of so detached from everything else that's not empirical, but on the other hand, it plays such a central role in the whole sphere of life that it will have these unintended consequences? Or
I don't know. I mean, you might say the same thing you just said about science, about economic development in general. It creates a lot of problems, and it makes our lives better in many ways, while at the same time creating problems, but also offering the hope of solving those problems. That's partly thanks to technological development, which is partially thanks in turn to scientific development. I don't know that there's anything special about science here. It's rather more something that's maybe special about human beings in general. We have a lot of different conflicting desires, short-term and long-term desires, and we often have trouble sorting out what really is ultimately the best for us at any one time. We know and have known for a while about climate change, but even knowing about it and taking it very seriously, we're still, jumping on planes to fly to the other side of the world to, well, discuss what to do about climate change. And, you know, that's not, I'm not saying that's not justifiable, but I think you can, at least I can feel in my own mind or heart that there's a little bit of conflict there about, on the one hand, wanting to take advantage of everything I could do right now, and on the other hand, some sort of foresight of where this is all heading. That's a kind of a pretty standard feature of our human emotional and intellectual machinery. And probably, if we were going to put the blame on anything that's able to pull in two directions at once, it would be that, not science.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. Well, Michael, I just want to ask you one last question. What are you currently working on? Are you still working on questions about science and the scientific method?
Well, I'm still very interested in questions about how science as a social institution works in many ways. I mean, there are aspects of it that I don't discuss at all in the book, but which are still very important, to do with the norms by which just the social rules by which scientists get credit for their discoveries. There's questions right now, really interesting questions about whether the structure of the science game, all told, actually is pushing scientists to publish prematurely. A different set of norms about information sharing, about whether scientists should share their unpublished data, methods, and so on freely. These questions have all actually become even more prominent, perhaps, than ever, because of what people sometimes refer to as the replicability crisis, a kind of a perception that a lot of scientific research is being done more to win the game than to advance knowledge. So I spend all this time in the book talking about how well the game works, the virtues of the game, how it pushes scientists to do something that advances knowledge in ways that it just was not advanced by the otherwise totally wonderful philosophy that my ancient colleagues were doing back in the day. So the virtues of the game, but it's a real question is whether the gamification of science also is gone too far, where the people who've become really good at exploiting or simply playing by the exact rules that have been laid out are kind of starting to ruin science, or at least make it much less effective than it could be. So the question of whether we need to amend the rules in some way without losing what we currently have, I think, is a really big, important one that I'm thinking about.
Are you tempted to think that maybe this is just how it looks because we have this sort of short-term view, and if we look back at it in sort of 50 years' time, everything will just even out?
Well, I do think it's really important to appreciate everything we've gotten out of the game. So it's not, if you like, the gamification of science, to use a very newfangled word, has been around since the beginning. It's not a new and unwanted development. It's not that we need to turn back to just having scientists as independent thinkers who are unconstrained by anything like the iron rule. I think that would take us back to the wild, freewheeling, but also ultimately non-progressive days of natural philosophy. So we really need to appreciate what's good about the game if we're going to start tinkering with the rules. That, I think, is that is probably the most important insight I have to offer right now to the discussion.
Right. Well, Michael, thank you very much for discussing your book with me and for illuminating so many aspects of it. And
well, it was really great to talk.
Wonderful.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. And now Julia and I are going to discuss some of the points from my interview with Michael Strevens on his book, The Knowledge Machine. So, Julia, welcome back to the studio, as it were. So, do you want to start us off with some thoughts about the interview?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much once again for a very thought-provoking interview. If I were to choose one starting point, I would probably ask you to elaborate on one of the questions you asked Michael, which was the one regarding subjectivity and objectivity. In particular, at a certain point, you were basically pressing him to say a little bit more on whether he thinks that a sufficient amount of subjectivity, in a way, would lead us to objectivity. And he responded something like, well, puts like this, it sounds like magic. I just was wondering whether there was something else to your question.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, I didn't really phrase it very well. I was trying to get at something that I thought that Michael's book was doing, which I found interesting, but maybe I also misinterpreted it. Just take a step back. The context for that question was that whenever you, or at least the way Michael presents it in his book, when people have this debate about science and whether science is doing what science thinks it's doing, it's always a sort of an objectivity versus subjectivity debate. So either people claim science isn't doing what it claims that it's doing because it's mired in subjectivity. So, cognitive biases, cultural background, so on and so forth. Or science does do what it claims to do because it manages to get at objectivity. And that's by doing experiments and getting evidence. And these things are clean, objective things that are polished, that have no subjectivity in them. It's just polished objectivity. And that's, classic opposition in philosophy in many respects. What I saw Michael's book as doing was offering an account where subjectivity and objectivity are part of the same story. It's not one or the other, but they mutually reinforce each other. And it's that mutual activity that gives us science, specifically when that mutual activity is specifically applied to the scientific approach, it's what gives us science. So it was, what was it? I think it was Baconian convergence. So this idea that if you have enough experiments about something, that the opposing views will just be, and if these experiments show the same result, opposing views will be crushed under the weight of the view that these experiments are all proposing. And the idea, Michael's point, is that experiments are not just these displays of objectivity, but they're mired with all these plausibility rankings, amongst other things. So, what scientist A takes to be a significant result, scientist B may not. And we spoke a lot about plausibility rankings in the interview. But the point is that every result, every paper that publishes a result comes with certain judgments, subjective judgments, which can't refer to any rules, objective rules. And so there's this intermingling of subjectivity and objectivity in every paper. But at the same time, science eventually at different points reaches, let's say, a consensus on something. And so that thing is taken to be true and other things are taken to be false. And so the picture that I saw Michael as painting was that if you get enough of these pockets of subjective, objective papers, and you sort of add them all up together, they eventually form this objective thing. It gives you the kind of objectivity that science claims to give you.
I suppose is an objectivity understood as convergence.
Yeah. Through multiple subjectivities that are also sort of engaged with objectivity. It's not, yeah, exactly.
I like this reading. I just wonder whether someone, not sure if Michael or someone who's an advocate of an old-fashioned account of objectivity would simply rebut by saying, well, couldn't we instead say that science and convergence, science reaches convergence and objectivity despite these pockets of subjectivity, as you call them, rather than thanks to them, in a way?
I think if you're doing that, you're ignoring and not making explicit to yourself the debt that is owed to subjectivity, when you reach objectivity. Because one of the, the subtitle of Michael's book is something like how irrationality, or how an irrational idea created modern science, something like that. And the irrational idea is that we're going to ignore everything and just focus on doing empirical tests. But at the same time, there are all these human characteristics that are integral to people participating in this activity. So it's the harnessing of pride, of ambition, of sometimes maybe the desire for truth that gets people to do experiments. And all these motivations are, and all the plausibility rankings as well, are all part of these small accumulations of knowledge, of evidence.
Nice.
So I think, yeah, because they play such an integral role in the accretion of knowledge, it seems that you're doing something wrong when you get to the end of that goal, that you then just sort of take out all that whole aspect of it, just focus on it. And I think instead it should make you realize that you can't have an account of objectivity without subjectivity.
Yeah,
I think. And I think that's what's really interesting about his book.
Yeah, and something else actually that this made me think of is perhaps an important way. I don't know if it's in the book. It didn't come up in the interview. An important way in which subjectivity may contribute to progress is that it is because of very idiosyncratic and personal desires, and maybe also prudential reasons and will to dominate the competition of scientists and whatnot, that there are individuals that desires and will to dominate the competition or shine in comparison with other scientists and all, that individuals end up challenging certain dogmas that may otherwise have gone unchallenged. And perhaps that contributes in turn to the fall of a certain paradigm. In this sense, subjectivity is essential to the evolution of and the succession of paradigms.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important aspect of what he wants to say. Maybe not in those words, but I think that bears out from his book.
Nice. Okay, so another point I wanted to discuss a little bit more is that he says the disagreement on what a piece of evidence proves is part and parcel of the scientific practice. And I think actually this is another place in which the thought that there is this pocket of subjectivity enters the picture. Because, for example, in philosophy and epistemology, there are some evidentialist theories of justification on which a belief or a mental state is justified only if the believer has a sufficient amount of evidence for it. And one of the main critiques against this line of thought is that evidence alone cannot determine what is sufficient evidence. So you need an external criterion, a judgment, a thought, a belief, something that sets the threshold of what counts as sufficient evidence, and that cannot be set by evidence itself. And this objection is meant to prove that we can't say that the only relevant pieces of support are evidence. And here, similarly, I thought, well, exactly, there can't be a purely evidentialist theory of what science is, because every experiment needs not only support, but also someone who determines that that amount of support or evidence is sufficient to prove a certain theory. And that's one step forward, that any claim in science can't be proved only by an experiment, but also by the thought that a certain amount of experiments will be sufficient. Which, of course, opens up the question once again, is that arbitrary? You know, so when he talks about who sets this threshold, and how can we be sure that it's the right one? So also when he talks about disagreement, I suppose not only on how much evidence is needed, but also on what kind of evidence is needed, or the quality of certain experiments, or the details, or whatnot. The point is, does that threaten the achievement of objectivity? Must objectivity be impartial as well?
I think you're absolutely right that there is this element of arbitrariness in both on the micro scale of what a scientist or a group of scientists working on something together decide to count as evidence or as sufficient evidence, and also on the macro scale regarding what the scientific community decides, or when or why they decide to assign something the status of, this is correct now. We know this to be true now. It is not disputed that it is not true, and no one else is going to do the experiments anymore because it's just a waste of time. We've done enough experiments to prove this. I think it's inescapable that is arbitrary. There is an element of, because I think that's the part that's in subjectivity to a certain extent, and subjectivity will always come with a degree of arbitrariness.
Even though I have the impression that then at this point he may say, well, be that as it may, what the success condition, so to speak, is determined by the success of the predictions or of the explanations we can gain from a certain theory. So it's a sort of the justification for that amount of evidence being sufficient goes backwards, which then raises the question, are we sure that we want to think of predictability as the most important criterion to determine whether a theory is good or not, or to determine whether something amounts to science, right? Like, because I had the impression that he placed a massive importance on predictability. I mean, of course, not only him. I think probably it's the way we think about science today. And I was just wondering whether there are alternatives, whether it's necessarily so, whether we can't help but thinking of science as science because it allows us to make reliable predictions.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The first thing that comes to mind is he mentions that it's not always about predictability, and he gives the example of evolutionary theory, which doesn't make any predictions.
Yeah, though he does say that explanations are just retrospective predictions.
Right, yeah. Because I guess all explanations are just causal explanations, and so you're just retrospectively predicting what would have happened, right?
Yeah.
You can see why predictions are so powerful, right? Because saying this should happen based on this, and then watching it happen would really make you feel like you've accurately understood what something is.
Yeah, but is it like, so basically my question is, can we imagine a conception of science that is not necessarily linked with the notion of prediction? Or is that impossible? Like, insofar as we talk about science, we must be concerned with predictability. And if we're not, then it's not science, but it's something else.
Yeah. Can we disentangle predictability from observation? Because observation is an essential aspect of science. And because predictability is a future observation, but you wouldn't be able to come up with the laws of the motions of the planets without observing the motion of the planets. Okay.
The point is that I think we're looking for something that help us discriminate what's science and what's not science.
Mm-hmm.
So predictability is one criterion offered. The observation could be another one if we thought of it in terms of there must be a specific, as in sufficiently rigorous method. But then there's always the problem that there are, I don't know, contrasting theories that predict the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I suppose different kinds of methods that are equally rigorous.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I mean, and in those cases, the approach would be to just keep testing both methods, right? Just keep developing tests that are meant to show the shortcomings of one or the other. And to try to show that one is more successful than the other.
Yeah, but it's
The predictability in that sense, it would be something like, if your methods, if your theory states this, then we should see this.
I know. Is what I'm questioning is that this very thought. When you talk about success,
Mm-hmm.
you were already using the notion of predictability.
Yeah.
Basically, that is one. I mean, it may as well be that the answer to my question is simply that's a silly answer. Of course, you must think of them together.
Given that I would think that observation is central to the scientific activity, because you need phenomena to do science. You know, science is not theoretical physics. It's doing experiments or observing things. And then from that, trying to understand what the world is like. I would say that predictability is just a further step of observation. We've observed this. Based on this, we think things should behave like this. Let's see if things behave like this. They do or they don't, whatever. So predictability seems to be like a further development of observation or a branch of observation.
And you also said to get to know how things really are, which was also something else that I was thinking about when I was listening to the interview you had with Michael, because I was thinking, okay, when we think about objectivity and subjectivity, we feel this grip. We feel that the topic is important, and the distinction between subjectivity and objectivity is one that has a pull on us. And then one may wonder, well, why exactly? Like, why do we care that much that science returns us objectivity? Why isn't like, what's at stake? And of course, difficult question, but maybe
What do you think?
well, that's the thing. Like I was about to say, of course, you understand this better because you have interests in metaphysics, which I do not. So probably you can't even understand the question. Why do you care about knowing how things really are? I would probably say simply, well, exactly, maybe I don't. But then who knows, because there's also the objectivity of what subjectivity is. Like, what really is subjectivity probably means what is objectively subjective or something. Anyways, I feel like we're
I think that's right. That must be right, right?
not sure. I also don't want to fall into the jargon trap. But yeah, I mean, personally, of course, I'm much more led towards religious beliefs and what does mean, and
Mm.
more than to science, but this is just personal interest. So thank you, because it was really nice to having to
But that's
think
the
about.
thing as well about the irrationality of science, that it forces you to hold all these other things that we probably feel are more important to us and to our lives than causal relations.
Well, but this
Um,
is exactly what I don't think. I mean, the way he was talking was just like, well, let's make sure that we determine the scope of science very clearly. For example, let's focus just on shallow explanations rather than deep explanations, because this containment exercise is what allows us to afford success, i.e., predictability, keeping things simple, and not wondering what you were saying, right? Which was not wondering why A does something or what A and in A causes B. And I think that today we got very used to this flattening of the scope of research, and we forget that it's a very contained way of looking at the word. And seems to me that actually gained the monopoly of power, and everything that is deeper or that has bigger ambitions in terms of explanation is frowned upon as wanting too much or being silly. And this idea of progress as predictability became the king of the idea of progress.
Yeah.
The idea of, I don't know, it just is, it seems so important to us to know what will happen if A, much more than why does A exist, or any other questions we could have.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I think you're right. Yeah. I think the scientific spirit has definitely pushed out all these other things from the everyday sphere of life, not just the scientific sphere. People
But
are much more moved by
but
facts.
but I appreciate that you said spontaneously that there are more important things to us than causal relationships, because maybe actually you are right, and maybe even though at a societal level the science lens is the winner, but then in the day-to-day life what bothers us or bugs us is not that.
Isn't there some statistic which is like, I don't know, 50 or 80% of scientists believe in God?
I don't know. I would be, I mean, now I'm coming across as the most religious person ever. I just hate the monopoly of science.
Okay, this is hardly me doing quality research. Apparently, around 50% of scientists believe in God.
Google says.
Let's just say it's around 50%, which seems a reasonable sum. But that's
Yeah.
the thing. I mean, many people say when they do science, it reaffirms their belief in God, right? Because they find such uniformity and almost the appearance of design. You know, we're going back to the design argument from the 17th and 18th century. It looks like someone has set things in motion. That's how well things work. That it looks as if there is a God or a creator or something.
Because this makes absolute sense. But when you said that it made sense to you, I thought that you would have said something else, which is that maybe when you are a scientist, you train yourself to ask the question why, and at a certain point, and so you track the chain of causes, and at a certain point, as Wittgenstein would say, you reach the bedrock, and there is no why question that seeks a cause that can be asked anymore. And there you realize that you need to ask another kind of why question, which is a reason-seeking why question.
Yeah.
So we got already two ways in which two ways in which a scientist may be led to finding scientific explanations unsatisfying in the end.
That's very good. Aristotle also says that
You see?
in the physics.
um.
So yeah,
Anyways,
I think that's also a very good. Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, we've been wittering on for far too long.
thank you very much. It was very, very interesting and enjoyable.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. This is now the third episode I've done on science, so maybe it's obvious that I really like the topic of science and history of science and philosophy of science. But it was really good. It's an excellent book, very readable, and very interesting questions discussed in the book. So, thank you, Julia. Thank you for your time. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
listening to that, and thank you for discussing it. And thank you to all of you, the audience, for following. And stay tuned for many more episodes in season 3 of Please Expand. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.